Yeah, this is my NFL predictions for the upcoming NFL season. In last place in the AFC East, I've got the New York Jets. I've got them going 3-14. The reason they could do better is because they've got some talent on offense like Brees Hall and Garrett Wilson. There's not really a reason they could do worse because it's 3-14. That's about the worst they could do. And my hot take for them is that Aaron Glenn gets fired midseason. Next up in the AFC East is the Miami Dolphins. I've got them going 3-14. The reason they could do better is they've got some young players with potential, some, unproven players like Malik Willis could be a good starter. Achane, he's still young and he's been good. Reason they could do worse, there's not really a reason they could do worse. 3-14 is about the worst they could do. And my hot take is Malik Willis makes the Pro Bowl. Now that doesn't necessarily mean I think he's going to be super good, but the Pro Bowl has kind of not been the same in recent years. So I think, it could be like, Shedeur Sanders made it last year. I think it could be something like that where Malik Willis does just good enough to get a Pro Bowl nod. Okay, second place in the AFC East, I've got the defending AFC champions. They lost in the Super Bowl, but the New England Patriots, I've got them going 11-6. The reason they could do better is because if Drake May still is playing at an MVP level and with AJ Brown, that could be a very scary team that you wouldn't want to face. But the reason they could do worse is some of their players could take a step back and they're going to have a lot harder of a schedule this year because they won their division. And my hot take for them is that they won't win a playoff game this year. Okay, then first place in the AFC East, I've got the Buffalo Bills coming out on top. The reason they could do better is if they don't lose trap games. I feel like every year they end up losing some games that they shouldn't. So if they, avoid those this year, then they could have a really good record. The reason they could do worse is, Josh Allen does turn the ball over sometimes. He does make some kind of careless plays. And my hot take for the Bills is that Josh Allen will win MVP this year. Okay, last place in the AFC North, I've got the Cleveland Browns going 5-12. The reason they could do better is because their defense is pretty good. They've got a lot of young talent on there, like Carson Schlesinger and Jared Verse. The reason they could do worse, I'm not sure about their quarterback situation. Either going to be probably Shedeur Sanders or Deshaun Watson. That's not a recipe for success. And also their coach. He's a first-time head coach. So that doesn't make me feel confident. And my hot take for them is that they will start at least 3 quarterbacks this season. All right, this might be a little bit of a hot take, but I've got the Steelers going 7-10. I know they've, under Mike Tomlin, they've been about 500 or above every year, but no more Mike Tomlin. They've got a new coach, Mike McCarthy, and I think that this team just doesn't really have the talent on the roster to do much better than 7-10. But the reason they could do better is if Aaron Rodgers plays at a high level. We know he's got the potential to do that, but he's pretty old, and I don't know if he's still got it in him. The reason they could do worse is because a lot of their players kind of seem like they might be washed. Like, I'm not convinced in Aaron Rodgers or some of the old guys on that defense. My hot take is that Aaron Rodgers throws double-digit interceptions this year. In second place in the AFC North, I've got the Cincinnati Bengals going 11-6. The reason they could do better is, well, their offense could be unstoppable. We know when Burrow's healthy and he's got Chase and Higgins, that offense is one of the best in the league. The reason they could do worse is the reason they have continued to fall short every year is that Burrow ends up missing time. And my hot take is that Zach Taylor gets fired after the season. Then in first place in the AFC North, also going 11-6, I've got the Baltimore Ravens. They got a new head coach this year, but I still think this team's going to be pretty good. The reason they could do better, if Lamar Jackson, comes back and plays like an MVP, well, then this team's going to be pretty scary. The reason they could do worse, new coach. It's, I've always thought that Harbaugh was a good coach, and when you fire him for somebody who's never been a head coach before, I'm not saying he'll be a bad head coach, but it is a little bit scary if you're a Ravens fan, a little bit that concerning. And my hot take is that Zay Flowers leads the league in drops. Now onto the AFC South, I've got the Titans going 7-10. Reason they could do better would be if Cam Ward breaks out. He was the first overall pick not that long ago. He's definitely got the potential to be great, but he didn't really show that last year. Reason they could do worse, they're just kind of mediocre all around. There's not really any, it's just roster's just not talented enough to really be that good. I don't think, they haven't been good in the past. They didn't, make any crazy additions or anything, so I don't really see a reason why they would do much better than 7-10. But my hot take would be that they pull off a big upset in the regular season. Now onto the Indianapolis Colts. I have them going 8-9. Reason they could do better? Well, they were doing really good before Daniel Jones got hurt last year. And if they play like they did the first half of the last season, I mean, they were like, I think like 8-1 at one point. They were on top of the AFC, I think. They looked really good, but the reason they could do worse, Daniel Jones may regress. He's coming off a very serious injury, and I don't have a lot of confidence that Daniel Jones will be playing in MVP form like he was for part of last year. And my hot take is that Tyler Warren finished the top 5 out of all the tight ends in receiving yards. And I think this team is really interesting because I would not be surprised at all if they finish a lot worse than 8-9. Like they could be really bad, but it's just I feel like they have the pieces. I feel like their head coach. I feel like he's a good head coach, and this team is just a pretty big mystery. But I think 8-9 seems pretty reasonable. Now for a little bit of a hot take, I've got the Jacksonville Jaguars going 8-9. They won this division last year. A lot of people think they're going to be good, but I do not think they're going to be that good. I think they're going to have some struggles, but the reason they could do better is if they play like they did at the end of last season. They were not looking great all of last season, but towards the end they really caught fire. So if they, continue to play like that, then they're going to be A-okay. The reason they could do worse, Trevor Lawrence is inconsistent. I don't have a whole lot of faith in him to, play 17 games all at a high level. I mean, I guess don't have faith in anybody to do that, but him especially because he's just been inconsistent his whole career. And hot take, Travis Hunter picks one position to play. This team is also a really big question mark because, I don't feel good about picking them to be 8-9 because of how they played the second half last year. But it's also like, they lost their running back. Did they get better? I don't think they got any better. And I just, looking at this roster, I don't have a lot of faith. Winning the AFC South, I've got the Houston Texans at 11-6. The reason they could do better is if CJ Stroud plays like he did as a rookie. He looked really good as a rookie, but he hasn't reached that level of play since. And especially, in the playoffs, he looked pretty bad. So hopefully for his sake, he can get back to playing at a high level. The reason they could do worse, offense might struggle. The defense is the reason this team has been good in the past and why I think they're going to be good again in this upcoming season. But if the offense can't put points on the board, it's not going to matter how good their defense is. And my hot take for this team is that Will Anderson wins Defensive Player of the Year. Now onto the AFC West, I've got the Las Vegas Raiders going 5-12. The reason they could do better, they just got a new coach, and Clint Kubiak, who was just the offensive coordinator on the Super Bowl champion Seattle Seahawks, and they got some new quarterbacks, Kirk Cousins and Fernando Mendoza. Reason they could do worse, wide receiver struggles. That wide receiver room, not too good. They do have Brock Bowers, but he's a tight end. And my hot take is that Mendoza will replace Cousins at some point in the season. I feel like this is a team who definitely has the potential to maybe pull off an upset here and there, but their overall roster is still probably a year or two away from being actually competitive. Next up, I've got the Los Angeles Chargers going 9-8. I feel like this team their roster is way better than a 9-8 team on paper, but they've got to play the Chiefs and Broncos twice, and just overall, they do have a pretty tough schedule. Reason they could do better, they've got a lot of stars. I think Herbert's a great quarterback. They've got Ladd McConkey, Omarion Hampton, Harbaugh as their coach. They really do have a lot of talent. But reason they could do worse, tough schedule. You got to play a lot of tough teams. And if they lose the games they're supposed to lose, and maybe they lose a trap game here and there, then, that could be really bad for them. And my hot take is that Joe Alt wins Protector of the Year. Second place in the AFC West, I've got the Kansas City Chiefs going 11-6. They went 6-11 last year, but I think they're going to be a lot better this year. The reason they could do better is that I believe they have the best quarterback and coach combo in the NFL with Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. The reason they could do worse is they lost Trent McDuffie, Jalen Watson, and Joshua Williams, which is, they were all in cornerbacks, so that's really tough for the Chiefs secondary. My hot take is that Mahomes finishes top 3 in MVP voting. I think he's going to be back. New offensive coordinator Eric Bieniemy replaces Matt Nagy. Ever since Matt Nagy was the Chiefs' offensive coordinator, they've been a lot. Their offense hasn't really looked the same. And Bieniemy was their offensive coordinator when Mahomes won his first Super Bowl. So I think also the addition of Kenneth Walker, I think this offense is going to be a lot better than it was last year. And I think with a really good defensive coordinator in Spags, that the Steve Spagnuolo, that the Chiefs defense will be able to, hold their own, even though they did lose some talent. But they also drafted a cornerback, number 6 overall, Mansour Delane, so I think Chiefs are going to be back this year. First place in the AFC West, I've got the Denver Broncos going 11-6. Reason they could do better, they added Jalen Waddle. They did great in the regular season last year, and then they just added Jalen Waddle. That could definitely lead to success. But the reason they could do worse is Bo Nix's injury. He got hurt in the playoff game versus the Bills, and, I don't know how the injury is going to impact him to start the regular season, but if it has a negative impact, then that could be bad for them. My hot take for the Broncos is that Jalen Waddle gets 1,000 or more receiving yards. Now onto the NFC, I've got the Giants going 7-10. Reason they could do better, they got a lot of young talent. Jackson Dart, Scadaboo, even Neighbors, he's still young. They just got a new coach in Harbaugh from the Ravens. So that's really promising. The reason they could do worse, tough division. I feel like they're kind of, on the same tier as the Commanders and the Cowboys. I feel like the Eagles are still a bit better than them. So, they could really have some struggles in division play. And my hot take is that Isaiah likely will break out. He was on the Ravens with Harbaugh last year, but he was still kind of their tight end too because they had Mark Andrews. But I think he's going to have a really good year on the Giants this year. And I know there's a lot of hype around this team, but I'm not going to say they do any better than 7-10 just because I need to see more out of their young talent to believe that they have it. But I think in a year or two, this could be a pretty scary team. Next up, I've got the Washington Commanders, third place in the NFC East, going 8-9. This is a really hard team to predict because I feel like they could be really good or they could be really bad. I really don't know. 2 years ago, when Jaden Daniels was a rookie, they were great. They made it all the way to the NFC Championship. And last year, they were really bad. So it's hard to know which team you're going to get. But I'm going to say they kind of fall somewhere in between. Reason they could do better is if Daniels plays like he did as a rookie, he was phenomenal. Reason they could do worse, a lot of old guys who, if they're, who might not be in the prime anymore. They just added Stephon Diggs. He's been good, but, I don't know if he's still a top tier receiver. Terry McLaurin, good, but, not the best receiver out there. It's just, I don't have a lot of confidence in this team after what happened last year, and I am worried that Jaden Daniels, he's not going to be able to carry this team, and I just feel like they're not going to live up to their expectations. But my hot take is that Brandon Ayuk will never play for the Commanders. There's a lot of rumors that he's going to go there, but I don't think it's going to happen. So this team, I would say one of the hardest teams to predict for this year because they're one of the teams with the most potential, but also they've got a really low floor, and there's definitely a real chance that they could be bad again this year, just like they were last year. Second place in the NFC East, I got the Dallas Cowboys going 9-8. Reason they could do better, they've got a pretty solid offense. Dak Prescott, solid quarterback. CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens, two really good wide receivers. Reason they could do worse, they always find ways to disappoint. They never live up to the hype and the expectations. Hot take, Dak has a 3+ interception game. That's kind of a random one, but I feel like he does have some games where he just looks off. This team definitely has potential, but I just don't feel like they've got what it takes to win this division. First place in the NFC East, I've got the Philadelphia Eagles going 11-6. Reason they could do better, they've got a lot of stars. Jalen Hurts, I still think he's a good quarterback. Devontae Smith, great wide receiver. They just drafted Mekhi Lemon, who's got a lot of potential. They've got Saquon Barkley, who wasn't great last year, but he's been great in the past. Jalen Carter looks good. He's been pretty good for that defense. Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean. So they've got a lot of star power. The reason they could do worse, they tend to underperform. They tend to, every year I feel like they lose some games that they just have no business losing. And my hot take, no A.J. Brown, no problem. I think this wide receiver room is going to be just fine. I don't think they'll skip a beat. I think they'll be A-okay. And yeah, I've got them winning this division. Oh, a little bit of a controversial hot take. I've got the Packers finishing last place in the AFC North. I like the Packers, but I don't think they are better than any of the other teams in this division. I've got them going 9-8, so a winning record still. They are very solid overall. They've been a winning team in the past, but Micah Parsons is going to miss some time. And reason they could do worse, they've got a really tough division. The Lions, they underperformed last year. The Lions did, but I think they're still a tough team. They still had a winning record. Bears were good last year. The Vikings are also a pretty solid team, so that's not I wouldn't want to be in the NFC North because there's a lot of solid teams. And my hot take is that the NFC North, all the teams in the NFC North will go 3-3 in division play. Next up, I've got the Minnesota Vikings finishing 10-7. The reason they could do better is they've got a very good wide receiver room. Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and Juwan Jennings. Reason they could do worse, it's a pretty tough division. I wouldn't be surprised if they lose a game or two to the Packers, the Bears, or the Lions. And my hot take is that Kyler Murray makes the Pro Bowl. I think he's going to have a bounce back year in Minnesota. I think Kevin O'Connell's a really good coach. And with those star wide receivers, I think Kyler's actually going to look pretty solid this year. Then in second place, I've got the Chicago Bears also going 10-7. Reason they could do better, they got a lot of talent. Caleb Williams looked pretty good. Luther Burden showed potential. They've got some pretty good tight ends, Cole Kmet and Colson Loveland. So, I mean, they were good last year, but pretty tough division. Kind of what I've been saying with the other two teams in this division. It's tough. And my hot take is that Caleb Williams finally, becomes the first Bayer to throw for 4,000 yards in a season. A little bit of a hot take, but I've got the Detroit Lions winning the NFC North. I've got them finishing at 11-6. Reason they could do better, they've got a pretty easy schedule. They finished fourth place in the North last year, and that's gifted them a pretty easy schedule. Reason they could do worse, their defense is pretty questionable. They do have some good players on there like Aiden Hutchinson, but overall, the defense wasn't great last year, and I'm not sure it's any better this year. But my hot take for them is that Jared Goff finishes top 5 in passing yards. Another hot take, but I've got the Carolina Panthers finishing fourth place in the NFC South. I've got them going 6-11, which isn't too different from their record last year. They finished 8-9. Reason they could do better, young talent improves. Young, like Bryce Young, but also they got a lot of young players. McMillan, he was great last year. Bryce Young, he still showed some flashes. Reason they could do worse, they won the South, so now they got a first place schedule, which is going to be tough for them because on paper they're really not knocking my socks off. So I've got them finishing fourth in the South. And yeah, I actually, it kind of sounds crazy because they finished first in the South last year, but this team just, I know games aren't played on paper, but this roster does not impress me at all. In third place in the NFC South, I've got the Atlanta Falcons. I've got them going 7-10. Reason they could do better, Bijan Robinson. He's a top 5 running back, and he can make a difference in the passing game as well. Reason they could do worse, either Tua or Michael Penix Jr. as their quarterback. That's doesn't inspire confidence. My hot take is that both Tua and Michael Penix will start at least 5+ games. I feel like it's kind of going to be, I don't know, they haven't announced the starter yet, but I feel like they'll let the starter go a little bit. He'll be pretty mid, and then the other one will get put in and also be mid. But, I like them hiring Kevin Stefanski, and I think that, they're kind of going to be the same Falcons they've been for a while. I think they're going to be pretty mid. At second place in the NFC North, I've got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers going 9-8. Reason they could do better, it's a pretty weak division. I feel like they'll be able to definitely do good in division play. The reason they could be worse is Baker can be inconsistent. He's a pretty good quarterback, but he does have his struggles from time to time. My hot take is that Todd Bowles is fired at the end of the season. I feel like he is a good coach, but they just kind of haven't got over the hump with him. So, and a lot of people thought he would get fired last year. So, I'm not saying they should fire him, but I feel like they kind of are going to just because they haven't really taken that leap. I feel like it's going to be pretty much the same Buccaneers team. I think Igbuka is good, and I think they'll miss Mike Evans a little bit, but I think Igbuka will, be a good enough wide receiver to make it so they don't have to worry about that a ton. I like Bucky Irving. I do like Baker too. There is some talent on this team, but going 10-7 and finishing first in the South, I've got the Saints. I think that this team's going to be pretty solid this year. They've got a lot of potential. Shuck looked pretty good at the end of last year. Really, their whole team kind of showed flashes at the end of last year. But, Shuck, he was a rookie last year. He showed some potential, and I feel like he's going to be solid enough to the point where they can go 10-7, have a winning record, and maybe win this division. The reason they could do worse, they're pretty unproven. Mostly Tyler Shuck, because, he's kind of, he's the quarterback. And if he's bad, then you know what, this team will not win the division, but I'm banking on him being good enough to get this team to first place in the division. My hot take is that Kellen Moore wins Coach of the Year. I feel like it's going to be pretty neck and neck between the Saints and the Buccaneers for who wins this division. Or, even I feel like the Falcons and Panthers could maybe do it. I don't think they're great teams, but this is a pretty weak division. And I feel like I'm going to go with the Saints to win this division. Easiest pick of the day is having the Cardinals finishing last place in the NFC West. I've got them going 3-14. Reason they could do better, 3-14 is pretty bad, so you don't have to be great to exceed my expectations. Reason they could do worse, this roster is terrible. There's really nothing there that I feel very confident in. Hot take, I feel like Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to have a little bit of a breakout season. I feel like people have been kind of making fun of him and clowning on him, but I feel like he's going to be better than he has been. He was so good at Ohio State, and I feel like he's kind of finally break through this year. Third place in the NFC West, I've got the 49ers. I've got them going 10-7. Reason they could do better, they added Mike Evans. He's been a really good wide receiver throughout his career, and he could give this team a needed boost. Reason they could do worse, their whole team always seems to get injured. My hot take is that Nick Bosa finishes top 3 in Defensive Player of the Year voting. This team has a lot of talent. I think Purdy's good, CMC, Kittle, Bosa, but all of those players, have gotten injured from time to time. So I'm not convinced that they're going to be, and I just don't see them being better than the Rams or Seahawks, but overall I think they're a pretty solid team. Second place in the NFC West, I've got the defending Super Bowl champion Seattle Seahawks. I think they're going to go 11-6. Reason they could do better, they just won the Super Bowl. They played great last year. And reason they could do worse, they lost a lot of good players and their offensive coordinator, so that can really hurt. My hot take is that Jadarian Price finishes top 3 in Offensive Rookie of the Year voting. I think this team's still going to be good. I don't want to say last year was a fluke because it was not a fluke, but it was also like they just feel like a really kind of odd Super Bowl team to me. Sam Darnold was their quarterback, and I think Sam Darnold's good, but he's not maybe as good as the Patrick Mahomes and Matthew Staffords of the world. And I feel like this team's going to be solid, but I feel like they might, some of their players might come back down to earth a little bit this year, but, still, I think they're going to be good. Finishing first in the NFC West, I've got the LA Rams. I've got them going 12-5 this year. Reason they could do better, on paper, they've got the best roster in the NFL. I know games aren't played on paper, but if they were, this team would win the Super Bowl. Reason they could do worse, an old quarterback. Matthew Stafford just won the MVP, so I don't want to give off a negative impression or anything, but it does scare me when teams have an old quarterback. And my hot take is that Puka Nacua is a top 2 wide receiver in the NFL. All right, so a recap of the division winners. In the AFC, I've got the Bills, Ravens, Texans, and Broncos. In the NFC, I've got the Eagles, Lions, Saints, and Rams. And I think the teams that snag wildcard spots in the AFC, I've got the Patriots, the Bengals, and the Chiefs. In the NFC, I've got the Bears, the Seahawks, and the 49ers. Some kind of bubble teams I think could be definitely fighting for wildcard spots. In the AFC, I feel like the Chargers. On paper, they definitely have a good enough roster, but that schedule is pretty hard. And in the NFC, I kind of like the Vikings, but, they just haven't. I don't know if they're better than any of these teams listed, so I couldn't put the Vikings in the playoffs. Then for awards, MVP, I'm going to give it to Josh Allen. I think that the Bills will have a great regular season, and I think he's a great quarterback, so that would make sense to me. Offensive Player of the Year, I think it'll go to Puka. I think with, Stafford as his quarterback, he'll be able to get a ton of receiving yards, and I think the Rams will be good. Defensive Player of the Year, everybody says Myles Garrett, but I'm going to mix it up and give it to Will Anderson, who's also great. And then for the rookies, these are hard to predict, but I'm going to go with Jadarian Price for Offensive Rookie of the Year. I think he'll step up and be pretty good for the Seahawks. And for Defensive Rookie of the Year, I'm going to say Caleb Downs. I think, he was great in college, and I think he'll be good in the NFL. Coach of the Year, I think if the Saints win their division and go from worst to first, then I think Kellen Moore will be Coach of the Year. Protector of the Year, I'm going to give it to Joe Alt, just because, this is a pretty hard award to predict. I'm not going to pretend like I know offensive line that well, but I think he's really good. And Comeback Player of the Year, I think it's going to be Patrick Mahomes. He just suffered a very serious injury, and I think with the Chiefs, potentially being back in the playoffs, the NFL would be more than happy to give this award to Patrick Mahomes. Okay, this is a potential playoff bracket. Bills as the 1 seed, Ravens 2, Broncos 3, Texans 4, Patriots 5, Bengals 6, and Chiefs 7. And then in the NFC, Rams, Eagles, Lions, Saints at 4 because they won their division, even though they don't have a better record than the Seahawks. But Seahawks 5, and then 49ers 6, and Bears 7. And then in the first round of the playoffs, I've got Texans over Patriots, Broncos over Bengals, and I've got the 7 seed Chiefs upsetting the Ravens. And then on the NFC, I've got the Saints winning a playoff game. So we'll see how this take could age really bad, but we'll see. And then Lions over 49ers, Eagles over Bears. And then I've got the Chiefs falling to the Bills, the Broncos beating the Texans, Rams beat the Saints, Eagles beat the Lions. So then in the conference championship games, I've got Broncos and Bills, Rams and Eagles, which, I feel like that might be like too predictable because every year, there's some team that surprises you that makes it. But I don't know. I feel like these are definitely 4 really good teams, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if they make it this far. But then I've got the Bills and Rams going to the Super Bowl. I feel like Josh Allen's going to, I feel like the Bills are just such a good team and Josh Allen's such a good quarterback, and I feel like eventually they're going to make a Super Bowl. But with that being said, I think they're going to fall short to the Rams, who just have far and away the best roster in the NFL. And yeah, that'll do it for my predictions this year.